The big question at the conclave is, what are the cardinals looking for in a new pope? So our listeners, our readers, everybody around the world is trying to figure out exactly what the criteria are going to be for the next Bishop of Rome. And a handful of cardinals are actually speaking publicly, interestingly enough, before they enter the conclave. And one cardinal who's close to us at America Magazine is our own Archbishop of New York City, Cardinal Timothy Dulle. He gave an interview on the Today Show a few days before he left for Rome to come to the conclave. And here's what he said he was looking for in the next successor of Peter.
Cardinal Dulle, what do you want to see in terms of the next pope?
Well, you'd always, when you get to be 75 like I am, you kind of got in your memory bank past popes. And you kind of are always dreaming of a blend of them. I'd love to see somebody with the vigor and the conviction and the fortitude of John Paul. I'd love to see somebody with the intellectual wattage of a Pope Benedict. I'd love to see somebody with the heart of a Pope Francis. How we can blend them all, we're not in some laboratory doing genetic mutations here, but that's probably what we would look for. Somebody with the same style of Francis, that warmth, that heart, that smile, that goodness, that embrace, and maybe within a little bit of a blend with John Paul and Benedict when it would come to more, more clarity in teaching, more refinement of the church's tradition, more digging in the treasures of the past to remind us of what Jesus expects of us now. Probably a blend of the great popes that we've recently had. That's what we'd be looking for.
So that was Cardinal Timothy Dulle, the Archbishop of New York, speaking in an interview about what he was looking for in the next pope, saying, quote, he wants someone with the warmth, heart, and smile of Pope Francis, but someone with more clarity in teaching, more refinement of the church's tradition, more digging in the treasures of the past to remind us what Jesus expects of us. So what we're seeing around the world and from the College of Cardinals is a kind of a wide spectrum of characteristics of what they're looking for in the next pope. Clearly, there's great respect and love for Pope Francis, his simplicity, his closeness to the people, his spontaneity and pastoral style. But obviously that way of exercising the Petrine ministry, raised some eyebrows, caused a little bit of stomach issues for some people because in many ways it was unpredictable. And sometimes that frustration that people have felt has translated into an accusation of Francis causing confusion or having a lack of clarity in his articulation of the church's teaching and doctrine. So today we're going to try to unpack this topic on the podcast. What does it mean to say, as some of the cardinals are saying now, that we need to elect a unity candidate? What does it mean that a candidate would be a unifying candidate? Was confusion or a lack of clarity a particular failing of Pope Francis? So joining me to discuss these questions and much more are Sam Sawyer, editor-in-chief at America Magazine. Welcome, Sam.
Good to be here.
Gerard O'Connell is the first episode that we're having you on since our team has landed here for the conclave. You've been a busy man these days in the run-up to it.
I've been a busy man since the 14th of February when Francis went to hospital.
So our co-host of the Inside the Vatican podcast and our Vatican correspondent. So welcome. This is your show more than it is mine. So I'm sure the listeners are happy to hear you. And Zac Davis, co-host of the Jesuitical podcast. This podcast is also running in the Jesuitical feed. So I'm sure the listeners of Jesuitical are happy to have you on the podcast.
No, I'm thrilled to be here.
And welcome to Rome. You just landed.
Yeah. Jet lag is worn off. I've got a few coffees in, so I'm ready to go.
Awesome.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's maybe start by just explaining to our audience a little bit about what we mean when we're throwing around these terms about clarity, about confusion, and about the unity of the church and the argument for the unity of the church. And Sam, maybe I'll start with you. So you've thought about this quite a bit. You've written about it in the pages of America. So when people say that there was some confusion around the church's teaching caused by Pope Francis, what exactly are they referring to, or what do they mean by that?
So I think there are at least two levels here that are worth paying attention to. One is that Francis was much more spontaneous than we've seen other popes be in the past. So his communication style was more informal. He gave a remarkable number of interviews, including 2 that were published in the Pages of America, and which we're very grateful to have. But his style of communication, I think I said on our previous podcast episode that one of the things I will always remember about Francis is holding my breath every time he got on a plane, waiting to see what he would say next. So I think that level of spontaneity and the informality with which he was willing to speak sometimes led to some surprises. And some people, when they say confusion, they mean informality, right? Like we're not entirely sure how this was sourced and footnoted, and kind of having to backtrack a little bit to understand what level of authority something that Pope Francis said in an interview or in a press conference had relative to the more formal documented magisterium. But I think there's another level about the question about confusion that comes about specifically often in regard to moral teaching and how Pope Francis wanted to do pastoral outreach to people who were in what we canonically might call irregular situations. So
complicated situations.
Yeah,
people who are divorced and remarried, people,
LGBTQ people.
Yep.
And so the willingness Pope Francis had to engage directly with those people and to pay attention to the particularities of their situations, and speak with them, about where they were and how they were experiencing God without always wrapping it in a clear moral denunciation of whatever was irregular in the situation. That's what some people mean when they say clarity and confusion. So examples there would be things like, Fiducia Supplicans, the document that allowed for a possibility of blessings of persons in some of these irregular unions, or, the famous footnote in Amoris Laetitia about communion for the divorced and remarried.
So just to go back a little bit, so previously, before the pontificate of Pope Francis, the teaching of the 2 most recent popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, was that a couple who were divorced and remarried without an annulment were actually living in an adulterous relationship and therefore could not participate in the sacramental life of the church. In other words, they couldn't receive communion. Is that correct?
At least unless they had committed to live in chastity with each other.
Right. So when Francis held his 2 synods on the family in 2014 and 2015, this topic came up. Because when you're talking about family life, obviously a pastoral reality that many people are facing around the world. And in his teaching document, his apostolic exhortation following that synod, he wrote, I don't have the quote directly in front of me, but he said, when we are accompanying people through these complicated situations, there can potentially be access to communion, access to the sacraments, even for people who are in those complex situations. And it was articulated in a footnote. It wasn't kind of, the meat or the heart of the document itself.
Right. And so I think, we don't need to rehash all of Amoris Laetitia on this podcast. But I think the point to be taken away from it is, while there are real questions about how exactly that teaching should be articulated, very often I think what we're seeing, and certainly what we're seeing in the sort of flood of media coverage and op-ed pieces and positioning around the issue of clarity in the weeks since Francis passed away, is that I think one of the things we're seeing is that the word clarity is operating a bit like a code word, and it's serving to say, because who could object, possibly, right? Who could object to the idea that the successor of Peter needs to be clear in his teaching? That seems obviously good. But I think clarity here doesn't just mean we want the Pope to be more careful and more measured. Sometimes it also means we want the Pope to color within these particular lines that we are very invested in.
Jerry, you've covered many pontificates, obviously, and Francis was a first in so many different ways, including the way that he lived the Petrine ministry. So, when you hear this phrase, the Pope is causing confusion, there's a lack of clarity of the Church's teaching covering that pontificate. How did that manifest itself in here from the position of the Vatican?
Well, first of all, how I perceive it myself, I feel that people haven't read the Gospels very clearly. Because if people said that Jesus was strictly responding to what was the Old Testament, etc., that he was when he was spontaneous. They didn't quite know what he was going to do many times. And Francis was exactly like that. And he would surprise them. And the scribes and the Pharisees, they were pretty disturbed. He was breaking the tradition. And I sometimes when I hear this kind of criticism of Francis, I say to myself, well, maybe these people should go back and read the Gospels and see how Jesus reacted. That's my very first response. Secondly, people have been taught certain things in seminaries. And they've gone on then to be priests, bishops, cardinals, even popes. And they have really not deviated much from what they were taught. And they have not sometimes even kept abreast of the developments of theology.
So as if like what they're being taught in terms of the church's moral teachings are kind of set in stone, and so they just accept them for what they are, but case closed, there's no more conversation.
Yes, Francis always said, that he didn't like what he called morality from the belt downwards. And he felt there was a lot of thinking in current Catholic ministry, which is that kind of thinking. And he set out from day one to readdress. Remember, he came from an experience of going into the shanty towns and seeing how people were living. And he always said, reality is more important than ideas. And people so often were working from ideas, from standards, but the real life of people, what is it? And Francis says, God is speaking through the real life of people too, not just through the and so many in the clerical world found this difficult to accept. But he felt, I too have the Spirit of God. And he said, I'm here because the Spirit of God, I didn't look for the job, and God chose me. And so he felt he was speaking also as one who had God's Spirit, and for that function, as pastor of the Universal Church, as the teacher, the source, the center of unity and orthodoxy. So when people say he was dividing the church, he was creating confusion, I wish they'd come to the funeral mass. He was bringing together so many diversities at that mass.
Yeah, it was a profound experience of unity.
I feel like Francis's style is one of encounter. It's one of seeing the person. And the clip that I keep thinking of that's been making the rounds on social media is when he was asked by the child, the young boy, who approaches him in trepidation to, whisper in his ear, is my father, who was an atheist, who died recently, is he in heaven? And, Francis, doesn't miss a beat and comforts him and consoles him, and asks if he can share what he told the boy to the crowd. He doesn't give a theological discourse. No, he responds to a child's courageous but tender question. And I think, for the Pope to answer a question like that in front of an audience is a risky one. But his answer, your father was a good man, and it was easy. It's far more difficult for someone who's an atheist to baptize their kids than someone who's a believer. Yes. Do you think, God's heart is the heart of a father? Do you think he abandons his children? And the children, yell no. And it makes me weep every time. But this is, I think, I pulled this example out particularly because it's not one that is sort of in an area of sexual morality. But this was Francis's style across the papacy, not just in those neuralgic issues that we tend to become obsessed with.
No, Zach, I think you're right. I think that's a beautiful example. And, you're also right that it's not exclusively issues of sexual morality where this came up, but sometimes how Francis spoke about relationships with people of other religions, or as in this example, the question of how God deals with those who do not explicitly share the Christian faith. But the willingness, Francis's focus on pastoral encounter first, I think it's important to say, I don't think it's fair to treat that as a lack of clarity. What it is instead, I think, is clarity about something else. It's clarity about the fact that God deals with us in mercy first. And a concern, and I think Francis was always profoundly concerned about whether or not people could actually hear that mercy as a credible proclamation of the gospel. And that was what he insisted on. The church has to proclaim God's mercy in a way that people actually can hear it and feel it.
Well, and I think it's fair to say that if you, after you're done being moved by watching an encounter like that, it does raise questions for you. And for lots of people that say, wait a minute, didn't the church used to say that there's no salvation outside of the church? Why is the Pope saying this now? Now, wait, what am I supposed to believe? And it does unsettle you a little bit and ask you, it's like, okay, I'm clear that God is merciful, but I do have questions after that. So in a certain sense, like, I am confused and I have questions now.
Well, and I think this might be an example of, Francis as the Jesuit. I think Francis would say, like, good, and you'll learn about it, right? There are resources. We can, like, those are questions that the church can answer and that the tradition has resources for. But he wasn't afraid of the fact that people would be at least momentarily confused, because he trusted that God would be at work within that. And if the confusion was because of encountering the profound depth of God's mercy, then that'll lead you deeper into the heart of the gospel and the tradition of the church.
Yes, Francis was profoundly disturbed by the mentality that the person, the priest, the bishop, the whatever, cardinal, has the answers before the questions are asked.
Yeah.
That they have it all packaged clearly in the mind, that we know whatever the question may be, however new the question may be, we have the answer in our head. Francis says this is not it, and we cannot anticipate the mind of God.
I think he said it was one of his apostolic exhortations that flew a little bit below the radar on living a life of holiness, gaudete et exultate. And one of his lines in that document is, a person who has an answer to every question, that's a sure sign that they're on the wrong path. Mm-hmm. Right. So he was interested in asking the right questions and getting to the heart, going deeper by asking questions, penetrating questions, and facing the complexity of the realities that people live.
Yes, he wanted to, and he was a great listener. He was a great listener because he wanted to hear what the person was really thinking and saying. So when he met political leaders, he very often he was briefed on them that they had this political agenda. This was what they were saying in public. He wanted to go, what is really in their heart behind all this public discourse? And so also with ordinary people. People would come to him to say something, and he wanted really to say, what really are you asking? And so he was listening before giving any response. And so with this little boy, he listened to him. And I think that really he was teaching by example. He always said, like St. Francis of Assisi, who says, you preach the gospel by deed, by acting, and then, if necessary, by words. And for some who have been trained, brought up with a mentality that they are going out to give the answers to the world, Francis said, no. And this disturbed them and it upset them because it was shaking the mindset with which they had carried out ministry to date.
Yeah, Jerry, as you're speaking, I'm remembering even in the opportunity you and I had together in November of 22 to sit in an interview with him, one of the things that I was really struck by was the intensity of his listening and the fact that he clearly, sometimes sort of frustratingly clearly, the answers were not pre-scripted. He wasn't waiting for us to finish a question so that he could give the answer he already knew. He was listening to the question, and then he was actually in conversation with us. Now, occasionally that made, and I remember some paragraphs in particular of that interview, it made it rather hard to parse afterwards. I was trying to figure out, wait, what exactly happened there? But I think it's because he really was engaged in conversation and not just waiting to deliver something he already had ready.
I want to come back to something Zach brought up because I think it's just important to acknowledge that some people in the church, some Catholics in the church, who felt that the Pope was confusing at times. This is a legitimate and very sincere concern, and there are some things where you could point to the footnote in Amoris Laetitia and say, this is opening a door that doesn't seem to have been opened before, and we can argue about whether or not that's the right decision, kind of on paper. But in a way, you can't argue that he's saying something now that his predecessors did not say. And so there is a kind of a development here. So, for people who, and these people who, make the case that the Pope is causing confusion, I think rightly say that the church does have clear teachings, and that is on purpose because we're trying to be faithful to Jesus, faithful to the gospel, and the church is a ministry, a vehicle of salvation for the world. It's not just, we like to say we like to live in a doctrinally sound church and therefore we do it. There are rules and regulations and walls because that's actually important to the memory of Jesus, but also for the salvation of the world. So I just wanted to put that on the table and maybe get your thoughts.
I think also some people might say Francis's style is totally appropriate for a pastor, but the office of the Pope actually has a different responsibility.
Right.
And maintaining sort of the clarity and the lines is actually, in the guarantor of unity, that's actually the role of the Pope. To the sort of informal, authentic, pastoral response. That's for other parts of the church, I think some might say.
Yes, but Francis was very clear that unity is not uniformity. Uniformity in different ways. Uniformity in thinking, uniformity in regulation, uniformity in liturgy. We have more than 20 Eastern Rite churches that do the liturgy differently. He approved the rite for the Amazon region. I think that the failure to distinguish between unity and uniformity is a problem. And Francis recognized that there's a great richness and a great diversity in the thinking, in the moral teaching of the church now in history. Look at the ecumenical field. Before the Second Vatican Council, a Catholic would not go into a Protestant church for a funeral or for a baptism. And there was that whole document on ecumenism revolutionized the church, and what was before clear thinking, suddenly, after the council, became a completely different thing. And I think people don't understand this, or haven't, or maybe have not been sufficiently, I don't know if the word educated,
catechized
in this. People haven't been taught the history.
Yeah.
Right.
People's mind are very short.
Well, I was going to say we should also remember that Saint John Paul II in his papacy made tremendous strides in ecumenical and interreligious outreach, and these events he held at Assisi that some were scandalized by at the time, that now we think of as a core part of his witness. So to Sebastian's question, I don't think it's that anyone would disagree that the Pope's role as the guarantor and the center of unity in the church, it's not that that's unimportant or that it can be downplayed. The question is what actually works to guarantee unity, and how is the Spirit calling the church to exercise and witness to that unity? And I think what Francis has shown us in his papacy is that that unity cannot just be, as Jerry says, uniformity. It can't just be, here are the lines, you cannot cross this line, but it also has to be, okay, there are lines, there are central truths, there are parts of the tradition that are clear and the church holds to forthrightly. How do we then offer an invitation to people? How do we encounter people in mercy who are in a situation where the church right now can't reach them with just that existing articulation of the teaching? And I think Francis was trying all the time to reach people in those situations and to offer them a witness of God's mercy. And that is also an exercise of of unity. That's part of the Petrine ministry, but maybe not one we had seen emphasized as clearly until Francis's papacy.
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised this question about Assisi, Sam, because I remember I actually attended that 1986 first meeting in Assisi of the different religions. And here is very interesting. John Paul II was accused of creating confusion about religion, that making all religions equal. So much so that Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, then prefect of the doctrine of the faith,
And the future Pope
refused to
Benedict.
go. He did not go to that meeting. He felt that it was making confusion in people's minds about other religions and the Catholic faith. I think for those who are accusing Francis today of creating confusion, they should go and analyze what happened then in, I think it was October
Yep.
1986. And you see John Paul II and then the future Pope Benedict being absolutely in different positions. And I think that may be a lesson for those who are saying Francis is creating confusion. How many people criticized him for one thing or another, his Populorum Progressio, for his Humanae Vitae. And they were saying there was very great division, perhaps much more so than we have today, because if you look back at 1968 and look in the history, and so I think people are just not aware of the history and not aware of the doctrinal history and not aware.
Well, and I think maybe one of the messages from that history is that unity is worked out sometimes in the midst of confusion, not in advance of it.
Yeah, I want to talk about unity because that's emerged as one of the main narratives and sort of pushes among the cardinals, right, Sebastian?
Yeah, and I want to reference actually an article by Jason Horowitz in the New York Times, who had a couple of days ago published something on this and had a couple of sound bites from cardinals that he included. So he said there is, a group of cardinals in this conclave who is concerned about confusion that was caused by Pope Francis in their minds. And he said they have, quote, a seductively simple slogan this time around, which is this word unity. So he quotes Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, who's a former prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, now the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, who Francis did not renew his term when his term was up. And he's been a pretty vocal critic of Francis, like not just now since his death and in the conclave, but for many years. And he's quoted as saying, the cardinals need to look for the unification of the church. It is necessary to speak about the division in the church today. And then Jason also spoke to Cardinal Michael Czerny, a Jesuit from Canada, but has spent many, many years working here at the Vatican. And he's quoted responding to Cardinal Mueller in this argument for unity as saying, that sounds really good, but what it really means is a reversal, as if unity was going to solve all of our problems. So Cardinal Czerny sort of saying that we, the cardinals, should not necessarily be looking at this matter of unity as the primary priority in electing the next
Well,
pope.
this quote from Czerny, I think someone could hear that and be, see, he's proving our point. Some cardinals want to go backwards on unity, or like don't want us to go backwards to unity. They want to keep going in the opposite of unity. And I think we should, I don't know, just call it what it is. Like unity is in some ways being used as a code word here. So it is not the case that Cardinal Michael Czerny wants the church to be fractured.
Right.
Correct?
But he actually says in the article, like, the priority shouldn't be unity. It should be, another word, diversity.
Yes, and I think if you go to the whole understanding of God, God is one, God is three. Mm-hmm. Well, is he one or is he three?
Well, or I think, to put it in terms from Francis's papacy, the poles here of unity are, on the one hand, unity as one confession of the faith, one church, one way of approaching God, and on the other hand, todos, 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 right? Everyone, 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 and the mission of the church to include and to reach and to evangelize. And those are both aspects of unity. So the question is, it's not, is unity a good thing? Of course, unity is a good thing. The question is, what does unity mean as it's being used as kind of a central priority of the conclave? I think one of the things that's in the background there is, and what I hear certainly in the background of what Cardinal Mueller has been saying, is the idea that the unity of the church is somehow threatened, right? That it's fragile right now. And I think that that's a question the cardinals are going to have to answer, right? Is the unity of the church really in a moment of fragility, or is it in a moment of expansion and development? And I think, to Jerry's point from earlier, standing on the colonnade and looking out at Francis's funeral, like, the church was in unity there, but it looks different than it has looked before. And amen to that.
I totally agree, Sam. I do think one of the things the cardinals are looking at is, under the Francis papacy, you saw a flexibility or to tolerate a wide application of church discipline. I would say, I think that's the most technical and accurate way to put it. Where you could see a situation where, particularly with the blessings of people who are in irregular unions with fiducia supplicans, that's going to land one way in Germany and a totally different way in Africa. Or what the church needs in the Amazon is not going to be what the church needs in the United States. And Francis looked at that and I think said, I'm okay with that. That's fine with me. But a lot of people are very nervous about going down that path because I think the legacy of the number of schisms we've had in the church still looms pretty large in their mind.
They also, and I remember when Francis was not Francis, when he was Cardinal Bergoglio in Buenos Aires and not using the name Cardinal, he would baptize, go into the shanty towns and baptize the children of unmarried mothers. He got reprimands from top officials here for doing that. And some of them, after the 2005 conclave, they wanted to bring him out of Buenos Aires and put him in an office in Rome and domesticate him and so kind of remove him. And he refused. But this question of the baptism of children of unmarried mothers, he continued doing it. And when he became Pope, he did it in the Sistine Chapel. Mm-hmm. And he said the child has a right to baptism. And for those who were fixed in a certain kind of doctrinal or disciplinary or moral thinking, this was really deviating from the truth. And they saw that as moving away from clarity of doctrine. And do the cardinals want to go back and reverse this? I think we have to go to very, very... And then I remember very well when we went to Abu Dhabi and he signed the document on human fraternity.
With the Grand Imam from Al-Azhar, so someone who he had great respect for.
And he'd worked on that document by himself with the Grand Imam, and only their secretary, the secretary of his secretary and the assistant knew that it was him coming. And people, his statement there about, God, there are different ways to God.
Different pathways to God.
This was considered heresy. Now, of course, sure, Jacques Dupuy was taken to task here by the Doctrine of the Faith under John Paul II on this question. Mm-hmm. I remember it very well. But Francis, he has opened up a whole new dialogue with Islam that no pope in history has done. Is this bad? Is this confusing? I think history will vindicate him more than the purveyors and the accusers of confusion.
Jerry, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, because it struck me in observing this from, the other side of the ocean, that one of the ways that this kind of question of unity versus confusion can sometimes work is that it often is exercised like a sort of heckler's veto by whoever is the most afraid of the church falling apart. Um, and and that once a fear is articulated, like, oh, if people understand this the wrong way, then something very bad will happen to the church, then it's almost as if everybody is expected to scurry around and circle the wagons and make sure we make it utterly clear. And I think one of the things that was so surprising and new about Francis is that he just didn't have that fear. And he didn't freeze up when those moments happened. He said, basically, like, I remember at one point he was asked on the plane when there was some significant American opposition to him, "Are you afraid of schism?" And he said, "Of course I do not want schism, but I am not afraid."
Yes, and this was Francis was a free man, and he was not tied in his mind or in his heart like some of our church leaders are. And I think we're seeing this play out now in the pre-conclave discussions, that there are still. Francis started out his document, his first document, the Evangelia Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. It was his programmatic document, and what is at the center of it? We need a conversion, starting out the conversion of the papacy, then the conversion of the bishops, then the conversion of the, right down to the conversion of individuals. Conversion. And for some, conversion is a painful process, and they don't want it.
Let's just, as we wrap here, one final question for all of you. So feel free to jump in. But I wonder, like, let's look at this moment that we're in. You know, a few days before a conclave starts. For our listeners, for our readers, you are probably seeing in different media outlets on social media, like, this case for unity being made. Some other arguments from other cardinals, but many cardinals will not be speaking, so it's not like you get publicly a response from everybody. So we're not totally sure what the dynamic is inside of the room. How should we be processing this moment? What should we be doing when we hear these different arguments? How should we be reading them?
Well, ask a Jesuit, you're going to get an answer involving discernment. And I would say one of the questions I would encourage people to ask as they're reading is, Jerry just articulated, does this come from a place of freedom or from fear? Because if it's coming from fear, then I would say there is a stronger than normal chance that not the good spirit is at work in that. But if it's coming from a place of freedom, if it's coming from a place of fundamental trust in God and trust in the witness of the church and God's activity in the church, then I think that's something that has more of the energy of the good spirit in it.
I just keep looking at the reactions and the tributes to Francis, particularly in the non-Catholic world. And you don't hear words like confusion. In fact, you hear the opposite. Francis restored a sense of moral credibility, that he was able to be a morally clear voice that the world listened to. And so if, our concern is evangelization, which is another top priority I'm hearing people discuss, I think the path that Francis kind of laid out for us is risky, but might be the only possible one.
And I think not only credibility for himself, but credibility for the gospel is what Francis restored.
I think I remember Francis, the first time I even met him, he says, "Pray for me." Mm-hmm. And I think this is really what we should be doing at this point. People should be praying for the cardinals. Because if we believe that the Spirit of God is at work in the conclave, praying that they have their hearts open to that Spirit.
It sounds like, apart from unity, which might be one factor that the cardinals are looking for, maybe a sense of that interior freedom that Francis displayed so openly and was such a model for, is also something that they're looking for. I just want to note to our audience that America does have an excellent analysis piece on this exact topic from Jason Blakely and David Albertson. They basically make the case that the church's moral teachings were lived out by Francis in this more integrated, holistic way, beyond simply reiterating established church teaching or quoting the catechism. So make sure you go to americamagazine.org and check that out. We'll also link to it in the show notes. Father Sam, Jerry, Zach, thanks very much for the conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian.